So, what do we make of this ceasefire? Is it going to last? Is it a good thing? Is it not a good thing? These are all questions that, time will tell. I'm not really sure how long a ceasefire with this regime can last. And it certainly is a bit worrisome if Trump gets his wish of creating a Venezuela situation. We've been talking about that for weeks, where he's trying to salvage whatever leadership there is in the regime that still has power to hold things together and do business with them rather than bring the regime completely down. These are all questions for another day, as we have to see how things play out in the next few days. I have a lot of thoughts on that. What I want to do in this video is I want to address how the Iranians are talking about the ceasefire. And we're going to do what we always do on this channel, which is take a look at Iranian state media. Now, I made another video about the religious aspect of this, about how they're seeing the relationship of the ceasefire to the 40th day after the death of Khamenei, which has very important religious significance to these fanatical 12er Shiite Muslims. Go make sure you see that video on this channel as well. But here I just want to take a look at Iranian regime media and see what they're saying about this. One thing that we've learned, if you're new to this channel, let me explain why it's so important to read the regime media. You might think, well, it's just propaganda. What difference does it make? It's just the opposite. Let me explain. Excuse me. See, if you live in a society where there's freedom of the press, where there's free media, then you don't necessarily know. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to have freedom of the press. I'm in favor of it. But if I read an editorial in an American newspaper, it doesn't necessarily tell me anything about what the government is thinking, obviously, because there's freedom of the press. And what you have in totalitarian regimes where there is no freedom of the press is that the media then becomes a newsletter put out by the regime. And that could be very helpful, because when you see what stories they're putting up there and what the editorial slant is and what the analysis is saying, what you're actually getting is a peek inside how they're thinking and what narratives they're trying to push. And if you read that carefully, you read that critically, you can really learn a lot about who you're dealing with, what you're dealing with, and where things are headed. And that's why we do this here, looking at Iranian state media. I make it a point in my own, from my own understanding of things, to check in on the home media, the local media of all the players involved in any situation. So in this war, I've been reading Saudi media and Emirati media and Turkish media, and I'm reading all the media of the local media, Egyptian media, because you want to see what they're saying, and it gives you a fuller picture. All right, let's get right to it. Here we go. So this is the front page of WANA today, and I wanted to show you the front page, not because it discusses the ceasefire, but because it doesn't, meaning in the top story. You would think that the top story on the front page of Iranian state media would be the ceasefire, but it is not. The top story is the massive public turnout on the 40th day after the assassination of Iran's leader, and for why that is the top story rather than the ceasefire is the top story. And this is true also in Tasnim, which is the other regime media. That's the media run by the IRGC, where this is actually run by the government. It's really the same thing. They're both regime media, but they're two different outlets. Also there, the top story has to do with the 40th day after Khamenei was killed. So you can go watch that other video to understand that. But let's take a look at what they're saying about the deal. So first we have the official statement, the Iran Supreme National Security Council statement on the 2-week ceasefire. This was issued on April 8th, the day of the ceasefire. And here is the text of what they say. I'm going to read this in full so that we get their whole statement. The enemy, in its cowardly, illegal, and criminal war against the Iranian nation, has suffered an undeniable, historical, and crushing defeat. There's your opening sentence. Iran has won. The enemy, the United States and Israel, have lost. By the grace of the pure and holy blood of the martyred leader of the Islamic Revolution, His Eminence Grand Ayatollah Imam Khamenei, peace be upon him, The prudent measures of the supreme leader of the Islamic Revolution and commander-in-chief, His Eminence Ayatollah Sayyid Mujtaba Khamenei, that's the son, that's the new guy who no one has seen. May God protect him. And the struggle and bravery of the warriors of Islam on the fronts, especially the historical, lasting, and heroic presence of you, the dear nation, on the scene since the very first days of the war. Iran has achieved a massive victory and forced criminal America to accept its 10-point plan. In this plan, America is fundamentally committed to guaranteeing non-aggression, the continuation of Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz, the acceptance of enrichment of uranium, the lifting of all primary and secondary sanctions, the termination of all resolutions of the Security Council and the Board of Governors, the payment of Iran's damages, the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from the region, and the cessation of war on all fronts, including against the heroic Islamic resistance of Lebanon, meaning Hezbollah. That's what they say the ceasefire includes. Now, the Americans deny that, but that's their statement. Okay. We congratulate all the people of Iran on this victory and emphasize that until the details of this victory are finalized, there remains a need for the steadfastness and prudence of officials and the maintenance of unity and solidarity among the Iranian people. Islamic Iran, along with the brave mujahideen of the resistance in Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and occupied Palestine, has dealt blows to the enemy over the past 40 days that the global historical memory will never forget. Iran and the axis of resistance, as representatives of honor and humanity against the most savage enemies of mankind, have given them an unforgettable lesson after a historical battle. They have so crushed their forces, facilities, infrastructure, and all their political, economic, technological, and military assets that the enemy is now plunged into collapse and desperation. That's what they're saying, that they completely destroyed the American military, the technological assets, the economy, destroyed Israel, seeing no path before it other than surrender to the will of the great nation of Iran and the honorable axis of resistance. You understand, their narrative is that they crushed the Americans, they crushed the Israelis, they brought them to their knees, and there was no way out other than to surrender to Iran. The ceasefire is a surrender by the Americans and the Israelis. Now, this might be laughable, but I'll explain when I finish what they're doing here. They're actually doing something very important. On the first day, when the criminal enemies of Iran began this oppressive war, they imagined they would succeed in complete military dominance over Iran in a short time and force Iran to surrender by creating political and social instability. They thought Iran's missile and drone fire would be quickly extinguished and did not believe that Iran could deliver such a powerful response beyond its borders and across the entire region. Global evil Zionism had convinced the ignorant president of America that this war would finish Iran, allowing them, after removing this last bastion of humanity and mankind, to comfortably commit any crime against anyone they wished from then on. Meaning Iran, the Iranian regime, was standing in the way of these savages trying to commit crimes against everyone in the world. They dreamed of partitioning dear Iran, plundering its oil and wealth, and ultimately leaving Iranians immersed in chaos, instability, and insecurity for many long years. The brave warriors of Islam and their courageous allies in the axis of resistance, despite their hearts being wounded and torn by the martyrdom of their imam, decided, relying on Almighty God and following the Lord and Master of martyrs, to give these enemies a historical lesson once and for all. They chose to take revenge for all previous crimes and create conditions where the enemy would forever cast away the thought of aggression against dear Iran, fully tasting the flavor of humiliation and abasement before the great nation of Iran. With this strategy, and relying on the unprecedented political and social unity established within the country, unprecedented unity, right? Iran and the resistance initiated one of the heaviest hybrid battles in history against America and the Zionist regime, achieving all the objectives designed for this conflict during this period. Iran and the resistance almost completely destroyed the American military machine in the region. They dealt crushing and profound blows to the vast infrastructure and facilities that the enemy had built and stationed around the region over the years for this war against Iran. In regional dimensions, they imposed extensive casualties on the criminal American army and within the occupied territories. That's Israel. They delivered heavy and shattering blows to the enemy's forces, infrastructure, facilities, and assets. None of this is true, obviously. They so constrained the field on all fronts that not only were none of the enemy's main objectives realized, but the enemy realized approximately 10 days after the start of the war that it would in no way have the capability to win this war. For this reason, it began attempting to establish contact with Iran and requesting a ceasefire through various channels and methods. You see, asking for a ceasefire, saying you want to negotiate, calling for a ceasefire itself to them is a sign of weakness. The honorable nation of Iran must know that by the grace of their children's struggle and their historic presence on the scene, the enemy has been pleading for over a month for the cessation of the fierce fire of Iran and the resistance. However, the country's officials, because it had been decided from the very beginning that the war would continue until objectives were achieved, including the enemy's regret and desperation and the removal of long-term threats from the country, gave a negative response to all these requests. And the war continued until today, which is the 40th day. They're pointing out that it's the 40th day. Go see my other video on the 40th day. Very important in Shiite Muslim thinking. The 40th day is very auspicious. Furthermore, Iran has so far rejected several deadlines presented by the President of the United States and continues to emphasize that it grants no importance to any type of deadline from the enemy. We now give tidings to the great nation of Iran that almost all war objectives have been realized, and your brave children have driven the enemy to a historic helplessness and a lasting defeat. Iran's historic decision, backed by the unified support of the entire nation, is to continue this battle for as long as necessary until its massive achievements are consolidated and new security and political equations are created in the region based on the acceptance of the power and sovereignty of Iran and the resistance. In this regard, I know this is going on a long time, that's part of the point. In this regard, and according to the prudence of the supreme leader of the Islamic Revolution, His Eminence, Ayatollah Sayyid Mojtaba Khamenei, may God protect him, and the approval of the Supreme National Security Council, and considering Iran and the resistance's upper hand in the battlefield, the enemy's inability to carry out its threats despite all claims, and the formal acceptance of all the rightful demands of the Iranian people, it was decided that negotiations be held in Islamabad to finalize the details. This is so that within a maximum of 15 days, with the finalization of details, Iran's victory on the field shall also be consolidated in political negotiations. To this end, while rejecting all plans presented by the enemy, Iran drafted a 10-point plan and presented it to the American side via the country of Pakistan. It emphasized fundamental points such as controlled passage through the Strait of Hormuz in coordination with Iran's armed forces, which grants Iran a unique economic and geopolitical position, the necessity of ending the war against all components of the axis of resistance, which means Israel has to stop bombing Hezbollah, which signifies a historic defeat for the aggression of the child-killing Israeli regime, the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from all bases and deployment points in the region, the establishment of a secure transit protocol in the Strait of Hormuz such that it guarantees Iranian dominance according to the agreed protocol, the full payment of Iran's damages according to estimates, the removal of all primary and secondary sanctions and resolutions of the Board of Governors and the Security Council, the release of all blocked Iranian properties and assets abroad, and finally, the approval of all these items in a binding Security Council resolution. It is worth noting that the approval of this resolution will turn all these agreements into binding international law and will create an important diplomatic victory for the nation of Iran. Now, the Honorable Prime Minister of Pakistan has informed Iran that the American side, despite all outward threats, has accepted these principles as the basis for negotiations and has surrendered to the will of the Iranian nation. Accordingly, at the highest level, it has been decided that Iran will engage in negotiations in Islamabad with the American side for a period of 2 weeks, based solely on these principles. Okay. It is emphasized that this does not mean the end of the war. Iran will only accept the termination of the war once the details, given the acceptance of Iran's preferred principles in the 10-point plan, are finalized in the negotiations. The negotiations will begin in Islamabad on Friday, April 10th, with complete distrust of the American side. They throw that in. And Iran will allocate 2 weeks for these talks. This time frame is extendable by mutual agreement. It is essential that during this period, complete national unity be maintained and victory celebrations continue with strength. The current negotiations are national negotiations and a continuation of the battlefield. It is necessary for all peoples, elites, and political groups to trust and support this process, which is under the supervision of the leader of the revolution and the highest levels of the system, and to strictly avoid any divisive comments. If the enemy's surrender on the battlefield is transformed into a decisive political achievement in the negotiations, we will celebrate this massive historical victory together. Otherwise, we will fight side by side on the battlefield until all the demands of the Iranian nation are met. Our hands are on the trigger, and the moment the slightest error is committed by the enemy, it will be responded to with full power. Now, this seems like insane ramblings, and there's a lot of lies in there. But let me explain where they're coming from. I'm repeating myself because I've said this many times. Iran never, ever thought that they could defeat the United States and Israel militarily. That is not their goal in this war. Their definition of victory, I know it's hard for Westerners to get this in their heads. Their definition of victory is that they live to fight another day. This goes back to the whole Shiite ethos. Shiite Islam began as a minority group within Islam that was battered and beaten, but continued to persevere. That's their whole way of thinking. So to them, if the great America and Israel and their air forces failed to bring them down, then they won. They prevailed. They're still standing. That's victory. And that's the way they're painting this, that the Americans backed down. The Americans couldn't take it any longer, that they backed down and they won. Okay. Now, so that was a kind of crazy piece because it's the statement of the regime. But then we have a more analytical piece, and this was published the same day, just a few hours later. Is the recent ceasefire a sign of U.S. defeat? Okay. And look what it does here. This is a fascinating piece. Not nearly as long, don't worry. After weeks of confrontation, a temporary 15-day ceasefire between Iran, the United States, and its allies has been announced, while negotiations to solidify it are still ongoing. Different narratives have emerged to explain this sudden halt in fighting. Different narratives have emerged to explain it. Why? Why the sudden halt in fighting? Some analyses argue that the ceasefire is not the result of a balanced agreement, but rather the consequence of the opposing side's failure to achieve its stated objectives. Very interesting. They're saying, you know why this ceasefire is actually happening? It's actually happening. This is the more interesting piece, by the way. The ceasefire is actually happening because the Americans / the Israelis, but mainly the Americans, failed to achieve their objectives, and now they want an off-ramp. There's some truth to that. This perspective attempts to present an alternative view of the balance of power by pointing to political and field developments, one that can be outlined through 10 key points. And now they give, this isn't their 10-point plan. No. This is 10 reasons why this ceasefire happened. Okay? It's fascinating. Check this out. This is their analysis. And you might wonder why they do pieces like this. I'll say it at the outset. I've mentioned this before. Like when they're predicting Trump, they'll give all the different options of what he might do. Like, why are they doing that? Why are they showing their cards? They're not showing their cards. They always want to show that they've got it all figured out, that they're not being fooled. So if they put forward all the different possibilities and they put forward all this analysis, it makes them seem like they're not being fooled. It's a strange game, but that's what they're doing. So here we go. We got these 10 points now. Check this out. Number one, the United States failed to achieve its most important strategic goal, overthrowing the Islamic Republic, turning it into an unattainable ambition for Washington and its allies. In this regard, Iran's adversaries effectively suffered a major defeat. There you go. Exactly what I just said before. Their definition of defeat is that they failed to take down the regime. We don't think of that as victory, right? Like we battered them, we killed all their leadership, we like beat them to a pulp, knocked out their whole Air Force, their whole Navy, No, but to them, you wanted to bring down the regime and you failed, and therefore you lost. Okay? That's their number one point of what led to the ceasefire. Number two, Donald Trump and his allies had claimed they would destroy Iran's military capabilities through force. They now acknowledge that this goal appears unrealistic. See? Iran's still fighting. They didn't destroy it through force. Look at that. Number three, the U.S. and its partners had aimed to bypass political agreements and use military force to remove Iran's nuclear materials and force submission. In this area, they faced what is described by this article as a historic failure, meaning they didn't remove the nuclear materials. Another failure. Number four, Washington had demanded limits on Iran's missile capabilities, threatening military action otherwise. However, in Iran's 10-point proposal, reportedly accepted by Trump, not really, there is no indication of such restrictions. Okay. Number five, the U.S. and its allies had planned to weaken Iran through military strikes and by activating separatist groups like the Kurds and other separatist groups. These efforts, however, were neutralized early and failed to materialize. Number six, the stated goal of reopening the Strait of Hormuz through military means was not achieved. They failed. They failed to open the Strait of Hormuz. Instead, Iran's preconditions regarding a new legal framework for the Strait were reportedly accepted as a basis for negotiations. This is real. This is a very serious point here. Let me drill down on this a little bit. You see, the Strait of Hormuz, Iran is on one bank of it, and the other Gulf states are on the other bank of it, UAE and Saudi Arabia. There's other states there, Oman. Why does Iran get to close it and control it? It's an international waterway. They're not allowed to. This is pure thuggish terrorist mafia tactics, where you grab something that you're not entitled to and then start negotiating based on the fact that you're holding it. Right? So they grab the Straits of Hormuz and say, we control the Straits of Hormuz. And now the fact that there's any negotiation over the Strait of Hormuz is itself giving in to them. I think that's the biggest mistake. I think this ceasefire is a mistake for a number of reasons, but that's right near the top of the list. Okay. Number seven. While the U.S. and its allies had called for regime change, not only did the Islamic Republic remain in place, but it also strengthened its position, rejecting a 15-point proposal and advancing its own 10-point plan. Look at that. How did they strengthen their position? You might say, what do you mean you strengthen your position? You're all dead. No. You see, for them, the fact that the basis of negotiation is not the American 15-point plan, but their 10-point plan, whether it is or it isn't, I don't know. But you see how they're framing it. That's considered a victory for them. Number eight, in the field of air defense, the U.S. and its allies are described as having suffered setbacks that could mark a turning point in military assessments. I don't know what they're referring to there. Number nine, the perceived damage to U.S. military credibility may have broader implications. Meaning, if the U.S. was incapable of bringing down the Iranian regime, if the U.S. was incapable of getting the Straits of Hormuz open, that is damage to U.S. military credibility, and it will have broader implications, potentially affecting global security order and altering existing power structures. U.S. failure. This is a really important point. And I hope the White House reads this, because what they're saying is, look, guys, if you were incapable of opening the Straits of Hormuz, if you were incapable of defeating us, then you now look weak on the world stage. And that's going to have global implications, and it's going to reorient power structures. They might be right. Number 10, regional allies, and this sort of flows from number 9. Number 10, regional allies of the United States are said to have reconsidered their reliance on Washington. That is real. You think the Saudis and the Emiratis want this war to end with Ghalibaf and Araghchi, with the remainder of the regime still in power? You think they'll be happy about that? After everything they've been through now for the last few months and what the relations are going to look like down the road, and the regime starts rebuilding itself and is still in power, you think they want that? You think they're going to trust the United States to see things through? Regional allies of the United States are said to have reconsidered their reliance on Washington, a shift that could lead to significant developments in international relations moving forward. There it is. Very, very interesting piece. Is the recent ceasefire a sign of U.S. defeat? And they lay out 10 reasons why they believe that it is. Before we go on, I just want to ask you to sign up for the Israel 365 Action newsletter. This is the organization that I lead. Israel 365 Action is a fearless advocacy movement standing unapologetically for the Jewish people's God-given right to the entire land of Israel. We will never surrender Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland of the Jewish people, and we boldly confront Israel's enemies wherever they operate. And on this, on our website, Israel365action.com, you can catch all my media appearances and all my news articles. But also, you can get plugged in with everything that we're doing at Israel 365 Action, advocating for Israel, giving you information so that you can be a better advocate for Israel, and just giving out a lot of very important information. And we have very informative webinars with top experts on a whole range, on all the range of issues that we deal with, geopolitical experts. So you want to get plugged in, go there, just put in your name, your email address, and you'll start getting our weekly newsletter. We're not going to bombard you. You'll get a weekly newsletter that gives you updates on what's really going on in Israel and links to a lot of important information. Israel365action.com. All right. Now, a few more items on the ceasefire before we wrap up this video. So let's talk about the Lebanon situation, because on WANA also, they have this ticker sort of updated stories. And the top story there right now is that Ghalibaf, that's the Speaker of the House who's doing the negotiations. He's this murderous thug. We've talked about him in previous videos. If he ends up being the guy who remains in power working with the Americans, the Iranian people are not going to tolerate that, and you're going to see more of an uprising. He is the most vicious member of the regime. Anyway, so he put out a tweet saying time is running out. Look what he wrote here. This is a tweet of his, or a post on X, whatever they're called these days. Number 1, Lebanon and the entire resistance axis. The resistance axis is the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, as Iran's allies, form an inseparable part of the ceasefire. Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif, that's the Pakistani prime minister, publicly and clearly stressed the Lebanon issue. There's no room for denial and backtracking. Ceasefire violations carry explicit costs and strong responses. Extinguish the fire immediately. In other words, what Ghalibaf is saying here, they're panicking over the fact that Israel is continuing to strike Hezbollah in Lebanon, because they're saying Hezbollah's got to be part of the ceasefire. Now, I find this kind of comical in a way, because Iran has loved to play this game for years, claiming that Hezbollah is an independent Lebanese organization, even though everyone knows that Hezbollah is an arm of Iran. Again, Hezbollah is not really a proxy of Iran. I've said this before. Very important point. Hezbollah is not a proxy of Iran. The Houthis are a proxy of Iran. They're an independent organization. They get funding. They get weapons. They're a proxy. Hezbollah is Iran. It's like the foreign legion of Iran. They're just not in Iran physically. They're in Lebanon, but they are Iran. Like when the head of Hezbollah was killed, Nasrallah, his successor was appointed in Tehran by the Iranian regime. Okay, they're just a branch of Iran. So when Hezbollah is still fighting Israel, that is Iran fighting Israel. And They used to always deny that Hezbollah was an arm of Iran, and now they're saying that there's no ceasefire unless the war against Hezbollah also stops, essentially acknowledging that they're part of their military. So it's a little bit comical there. Now, why are they so panicked about it? Why don't they just allow, throw Hezbollah under the bus? Why are they so panicked about ending the attacks on Hezbollah? Their regime's about to collapse. Why are they worried about this one proxy? Not proxy, this one, like I just said, this one arm of theirs. They're willing to blow up the whole thing because Israel is still attacking Hezbollah. So there's an analysis piece up on WANA also, explaining their behavior and explaining the bind that they're in. It's a very revealing piece. It's not so long, okay? I'll just read you a few. I won't read you the whole thing. I'll read you the key paragraphs. Urgency of a strategic Iranian response to the Lebanon crisis. That's the title of the piece, that there's an urgent need for a strategic Iranian response to what's going on there. The large-scale attack launched by Israel against Lebanon since yesterday afternoon has been described, they always use that language, by military analysts as the most significant foreign assault in the country's history. Okay. And it's a massive catastrophe, and they talk about, and they quote Israel's defense minister Katz saying how widespread the attack is. And now look what it says here. And then they say what's driving the escalation is that Netanyahu is trying to save himself politically. What should be done? This is the key. Look at this. According to this perspective, Israel may be anticipating a direct military retaliation from Iran and its allies, which could serve two objectives. In other words, what Israel wants to accomplish: number one, disrupting ongoing diplomatic efforts, such as the anticipated talks in Islamabad, mediated by Pakistan, and creating justification for broader regional escalation. Okay? In other words, Israel wants the war to escalate. They don't want the ceasefire. They want to scuttle the talks. And therefore, Israel is just hammering Hezbollah because they want the ceasefire to fall apart. For this reason, any response must be carefully calculated and strategically timed. The apparent delay in Iran's reaction may reflect an effort to assess the full scope of the situation. What are they doing? This is called CYA. They're covering their butts because they're not if they're going to agree to a ceasefire, but Hezbollah is still getting hammered and they're doing nothing about it, and they stop firing rockets at Israel because of the ceasefire, then they're looking like completely impotent and abandoning Hezbollah, and they look totally weak. So they're covering themselves by saying, well, the delay in response, the apparent delay in Iran's reaction, is really just because they're assessing the situation. Okay. At the same time, proponents of a stronger response argue that any retaliatory action must impose significant costs on Israel, enough to force a reassessment within Netanyahu's government. So if we're going to respond, you got to respond really, really hard. Among the proposed targets are key energy infrastructures. It says what they would hit in Israel. And then it says the article, it's referring to an Al Jazeera piece they mentioned near the beginning of the article. I didn't read that paragraph. The article also criticizes the Lebanese government for its silence in the face of the attacks, meaning this is their way of criticizing the Lebanese government, because the Lebanese government is not really stepping up to defend Hezbollah. They really want to get rid of Hezbollah. So they're calling them out. They're kind of warning them. Public sentiment on the ground in Lebanon reflects growing frustration. Okay. And then it says, look at how it ends. Ultimately, the response to the current crisis from this viewpoint should be both innovative and decisive, combining swift diplomatic initiatives with strong political messaging and potentially calibrated military action. They're covering their butts because they know that they're not going to take military action against Israel for its attacks in Lebanon. So they're saying that they're going, if ultimately the response is probably going to be something diplomatic and political and calibrated military action. Figures such as Abbas Araghchi, that's the foreign minister of Iran, are specifically mentioned as key actors who should take a leading role. The argument concludes that failure to act promptly could mark the beginning of a decline in Iran's influence in Lebanon, emphasizing the urgency of the moment. This is an awesome closing sentence. Let's look at it again. The argument concludes, meaning this article is concluding, failure of Iran to act promptly to defend Hezbollah, to do something about what's happening in Lebanon while they have a ceasefire with America and they're allowing Hezbollah to get hammered. So failure to act promptly could mark the beginning of a decline in Iran's influence in Lebanon. That would be a terrible thing. Iran can't lose its influence in Lebanon, and this emphasizes the urgency of the moment. Very revealing line about the bind that they're in. They need to respond. They need to flex their muscles and show that they're still the primary player in Lebanon. But if Hezbollah is getting hit and they're doing nothing, and they're impotent to do anything, then they look weak, and it's the beginning of the downfall of the regime. They can't allow that. They can't allow themselves to look weak. The thing that they fear most, what they fear most, is not attacks. It's not damage to this bridge or that plant or that military base. They don't care that much about those things. In the end of the day, what they care about is saving face and not looking weak in the eyes of the public in Iran, because that's what could really topple the regime. Anyway, that's what the Iranians are saying. That's what they're saying about this ceasefire deal. If you think about everything I've said in this video, the chances that this ceasefire deal are going to go anywhere, I think, are very slim. Meaning it could be temporary, but there's no way to have a lasting ceasefire with these fanatical Shiite 12er Muslims, especially if all they're doing in their media is trash talking how America lost the war. If the ceasefire does hold and they declare victory this way, there will be some truth to it, because you can't. The only way to defeat the regime is that it's clear that they're defeated, and then we have a chance to actually move past this evil. Until then, we're going to be dealing with these guys. That is just the reality. All right, folks. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this edifying, interesting, and I can't stress enough. It's very important to read the enemy media. You learn a lot about how they're thinking. All right, God bless. Thanks for watching.